I thought I was being the perfect brother when I drove 3 hours from Denver to Phoenix to surprise my family with an unannounced visit. My sister Angela had just gotten engaged, and I wanted to celebrate with them in person. Using my spare key, I slipped quietly through the front door of my childhood home, planning to jump out and surprise everyone in the kitchen. Instead, I froze in the hallway when I heard my mother's voice saying, "That stupid puppet will never see it coming." Laughter erupted from the kitchen as someone raised a glass and shouted, "To stupid relatives with money." My heart sank as I realized they were talking about me. Standing motionless behind the kitchen doorway, I felt my world crumble as my family revealed the depth of their betrayal. My mother Susan was explaining to the group how they had been studying my psychology for months, noting that my desperate need for family approval stemmed from being the outsider who chose college and a tech career over joining the family construction business. "Calhoun always caves when I start crying." My mother chuckled, taking another sip of what appeared to be champagne. "Remember last year when I told him about my medical scare? He sent $3,000 within hours for treatment that never even happened." My father Tom joined the laughter, his gravelly voice cutting through my chest like a knife. "The boy's always been soft-hearted. Guilt works better on him than anything else." Angela, my 24-year-old sister, whom I had always protected and supported, was giggling as she showed her fiancé, Brad, something on her phone. "Look at these European honeymoon packages," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We can book the deluxe suite in Tuscany once we get the money from the wedding scam." Brad, a stocky guy with perfectly styled hair and an expensive watch, nodded approvingly. "Your brother makes good money as a software engineer, right? $25,000 should be easy for him, especially when we tell him how much stress the wedding planning is putting on your delicate condition." My stomach dropped further when Angela burst into fresh giggles. "I can't believe he'll fall for the fake pregnancy too. I've been practicing my morning sickness act for weeks." Susan pulled out a notebook that looked disturbingly official. "I've researched actual wedding venues in Denver," she announced proudly. "The most expensive ones only charge $8,000 for what we're asking. We'll pocket the difference and tell him everything cost more than expected." They had even planned the emotional manipulation tactics. Tom suggested they could increase the amount by claiming Angela needed special medical care due to wedding stress. Susan added that they should mention how proud their late grandmother would have been to see Angela married in a beautiful ceremony. "Oh, Grandma Rose always said family should stick together." Susan practiced putting on the wounded voice I had heard so many times before. She would want Calhoun to help his little sister have the perfect wedding. The cruelest part was hearing them laugh about previous times they had manipulated me. The medical scare was just one example. They reminisced about the time they convinced me to pay for Tom's truck repairs by claiming it was needed for work when actually they wanted to upgrade to a newer model. Angela had gotten $500 from me for college textbooks she never bought. My phone buzzed with a text message from Angela. "Can't wait to see my favorite big brother tomorrow. Have something super exciting to share with you." The timestamp showed she had sent it just minutes ago while sitting in that very kitchen plotting against me. The irony was suffocating. Tomorrow was supposed to be their ambush day when they would spring their carefully planned trap. I would have walked right into their web of lies, probably agreeing to everything because I genuinely loved them and wanted to support my sister's happiness. Brad was explaining how they had already spoken to several vendors using my name and promising payment. I told the florist that Calhoun was too busy with work to call himself, but was excited to make his sister's day special, he bragged. "She's expecting a deposit next week." Angela added that she had contacted a catering company and given them my address claiming I had volunteered my house for the reception. "They think he's this amazingly generous brother who just wants everything perfect for me," she said with a smirk that made my blood run cold. The worst revelation came when Susan mentioned how they could probably get even more money in the future. Once Calhoun pays for this wedding, he'll feel so invested in our family harmony that we can hit him up for other things, she explained. Maybe Brad's business startup or a down payment for Angela's house. They weren't just planning to scam me once. They saw me as a permanent ATM machine, someone whose emotions they could manipulate whenever they needed cash. The systematic nature of their planning showed this was not a desperate moment of weakness, but a calculated, ongoing scheme. As I listened to them toast again to their successful manipulation, I felt something inside me break and then harden. These people who claimed to love me had been studying me like a lab rat, cataloging my weaknesses and planning to exploit them for their financial gain. I quietly backed away from the kitchen doorway, my mind racing between devastating hurt and growing anger. But underneath those emotions, a cold determination was beginning to form. If they wanted to play games with family loyalty, I was about to teach them that this particular game had consequences they never anticipated. Sitting in my car outside a coffee shop 20 minutes away from the house, I tried to process what I had just learned while my hands shook from adrenaline and betrayal. But instead of wallowing in self-pity, I decided to do what I do best as a software engineer: gather data and analyze the full scope of the problem. I started with social media, something I rarely paid attention to, but now seemed crucial. Brad's Instagram account was a revelation. Despite my family's claims of financial hardship, his feed showed expensive Rolex watches, designer clothing brands I recognized from high-end stores, and recent photos from luxury hotels in Las Vegas. The timestamps showed these Vegas trips happened during the same period when my parents claimed they were struggling to pay basic bills. Angela's Pinterest boards were even more damning. She had been planning an elaborate European honeymoon for months, with saved images of five-star hotels in Rome, private wine tours in Tuscany, and first-class airline seats. The estimated cost of her dream itinerary would easily exceed $15,000. For someone supposedly living paycheck to paycheck, she had remarkably expensive tastes. My parents' Facebook profiles showed a different kind of evidence. Photos from the past year revealed new leather furniture in their living room, a completely renovated kitchen with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and my father standing proudly next to a brand new pickup truck. The truck alone probably cost more than $30,000, yet they had been telling me for months about their financial struggles. But the real breakthrough came when I started reaching out to other family members. I called my cousin Jake in Seattle, someone I hadn't spoken to in several months. After some casual conversation, I carefully brought up family finances. "Actually, I'm glad you called," Jake said, his voice taking on a frustrated tone. "Your dad asked me for $5,000 about 6 months ago, said they needed emergency roof repairs after a storm and their insurance wouldn't cover it." My stomach tightened. "Did you send the money?" "Yeah, I felt bad for them. But when I visited for Thanksgiving, I noticed the roof looked perfect, like it had never been damaged at all. I wanted to ask about it, but the timing never seemed right." I thanked Jake and immediately called my Aunt Martha in Portland. Her story was eerily similar. "Your mother called me crying about needing money for a minor surgery," Martha explained. "She said the insurance company was being difficult, and she needed $3,000 to cover the copay. I sent it right away because family comes first, you know?" Martha's voice grew concerned. But when I asked her about her recovery a few weeks later, she seemed confused about what I was talking about. Then she quickly changed the subject. The pattern was becoming clear. Over the past year, my family had systematically targeted relatives across the country using emotional manipulation and fake emergencies to extract money. They weren't just planning to scam me. They had been perfecting their techniques on other family members first. I spent the next 2 hours making calls to cousins, aunts, and uncles I hadn't spoken to in months or even years. The stories were remarkably consistent. Emergency car repairs that never happened, medical bills for conditions that didn't exist, home repairs that were never completed. In total, they had stolen nearly $15,000 from our extended family in the past year alone. Uncle Robert in Chicago had sent $2,000 for emergency heating system repairs during a supposedly brutal cold snap. When he visited 6 weeks later, the heating system was clearly several years old and working perfectly. My cousin Sarah in Atlanta had been told that Angela needed money for college expenses, despite the fact that Angela had dropped out of community college 2 years earlier. Sarah sent $800 for textbooks and supplies that Angela supposedly couldn't afford. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: emotional manipulation, fake emergencies, and immediate pressure to send money quickly before asking too many questions. My family had weaponized our relatives' love and concern, turning family loyalty into a profitable enterprise. But what hurt most was realizing how they had positioned me in these conversations with other relatives. Several family members mentioned that my parents often talked about my successful career, emphasizing how well I was doing financially. They had been setting me up as the primary target by making sure everyone knew I had money. "Your mom always brags about your software engineering job," Martha mentioned. "She talks about your beautiful house in Denver and how proud she is that you're doing so well. I always thought it was sweet how much she supported your career choice." Now I understood that those conversations weren't pride. They were marketing. My family had been advertising my financial success to identify the best targets for their schemes and to justify asking for larger amounts from me specifically. The scope of their deception was staggering. This wasn't a recent desperate plan born from actual financial hardship. They had been operating a systematic fraud scheme for over a year, targeting family members' emotions and exploiting our cultural values of supporting each other during emergencies. As I sat in the coffee shop parking lot reviewing my notes from all these conversations, I realized that my family's betrayal extended far beyond planning to steal $25,000 from me. They had damaged relationships throughout our entire extended family, probably creating suspicion and hurt feelings that would last for years. But they had made one critical mistake in their planning. They assumed I would be an easy target, someone who would hand over money without asking questions or investigating their claims. What they didn't realize was that they had just declared war on someone who knew how to research document evidence and build a systematic response to their systematic fraud. I started my car and headed back toward the house, no longer the naive brother planning to celebrate his sister's engagement. Instead, I was someone who had just discovered the true scope of my family's betrayal and was ready to respond with the same level of calculation they had used against me. My first stop was a large hardware store on the outskirts of Phoenix, where I purchased high-grade deadbolt locks, a wireless security camera system, and several other items that would help me secure my house back in Denver. The elderly clerk seemed curious about my extensive security purchases, but I just smiled and explained I was upgrading my home protection system. During the drive back to Denver, my mind was racing with plans, but I forced myself to stay focused on the road and think through every detail carefully. This wasn't about revenge. It was about setting boundaries and teaching consequences for their actions. When I arrived at my house, a beautiful craftsman-style home I had purchased 2 years earlier in Denver's trendy Highlands neighborhood, I immediately noticed something that made my blood boil. My garage door was slightly ajar, and I could see boxes stacked inside that I definitely hadn't put there. Entering through the side door, I discovered the extent of my family's presumption. Multiple cardboard boxes were labeled in Angela's handwriting, wedding decorations, catering supplies, bridal party gifts, and reception materials. They had been using my garage as their personal storage facility for months, apparently already assuming I would agree to host the wedding. Inside the boxes, I found detailed evidence of how far their planning had progressed. There was a comprehensive timeline showing the wedding was scheduled for my backyard in exactly 3 weeks. Angela had created a detailed layout diagram of my property, marking where the ceremony arch would go, where tables would be placed, and even which trees would be decorated with lights. But the most shocking discovery was a catering contract with a local Denver company called Elegant Events Catering. The contract was signed with my forged signature and listed my address as the event location. According to the paperwork, I had supposedly ordered a full dinner service for 150 guests, including appetizers, a 3-course meal wedding cake, and open bar service. The total cost was $8,700, with a note that the homeowner had already been contacted about payment arrangements. There was even a delivery schedule showing when tables, chairs, and catering equipment would arrive at my house. I found similar contracts with a florist, a DJ service, and a party rental company. Angela had apparently spent weeks creating this elaborate fiction where I was the enthusiastic host too busy with work to handle details myself, but thrilled to provide everything for my sister's special day. While installing the new deadbolt locks on my front and back doors, I made an even more disturbing discovery. Hidden under a decorative rock near my back patio was a spare key that I had never put there. My family had apparently made a copy of my house key and had been entering my home regularly without my knowledge or permission. The violation of my privacy was deeper than I had imagined. In my spare bedroom, furniture had been rearranged to create what looked like a bridal preparation area. There was a small table with a mirror, good lighting, and space for multiple people to get ready. My bedroom had been converted into their personal bridal suite without my knowledge. My kitchen showed subtle signs of someone testing catering layouts. Certain cabinets had been reorganized, and there were measurement marks on my countertops made with removable tape. Someone had clearly been planning how to efficiently serve food to a large group from my kitchen. Most disturbing was a small stack of mail on my kitchen counter that I hadn't opened because I thought it was junk mail. Looking more carefully, I realized these were bills and confirmations from various wedding vendors, all addressed to me at my own address. My family had been intercepting wedding-related mail to hide the extent of their planning from me. One envelope contained a bill from the florist for a deposit I had never authorized. Another was a confirmation letter from the party rental company thanking me for my business and confirming delivery of tables and chairs for the following weekend. A third letter was from a photographer expressing excitement about capturing my generous gift to my sister and mentioning that Angela had told her I preferred to stay behind the scenes, but was paying for everything. The systematic nature of their deception was breathtaking. They hadn't just planned to ask me for money, they had created legal and financial obligations in my name, assuming I would have no choice but to pay once presented with signed contracts and scheduled deliveries. But as I installed the wireless security camera system positioning cameras to cover all entrances and the main areas where my family would likely gather, I realized they had made a crucial error in their planning. By acting without my knowledge or consent, they had actually committed several crimes: forgery, identity theft, unauthorized use of my property, and possibly fraud. I spent the evening documenting everything with photographs and organizing all the forged contracts and unauthorized bills into a clear evidence file. Every box, every forged signature, every unauthorized delivery schedule was carefully photographed and cataloged. The new locks were installed perfectly, and the security system was fully operational, with motion sensors and audio recording capabilities. My house was now completely secure, and I would have video evidence of everything that happened when my family arrived the next day expecting to manipulate me into paying for their elaborate deception. As I prepared for bed that night, sleeping in my own house, for the first time in weeks, without my family having unauthorized access, I reflected on how thoroughly they had violated my trust and privacy. They had treated my home as their personal property, my finances as their personal bank account, and my emotions as tools to be manipulated for their benefit. But tomorrow, when they arrived expecting to find their usual compliant target, they would discover that their stupid puppet had become someone who documented evidence, set boundaries, and refused to be manipulated. The confrontation would be recorded, their lies would be exposed, and the consequences they had never considered would finally arrive. I fell asleep knowing that everything was in place for them to face the reality of their choices, and that I was finally taking control of a situation where I had been an unwitting victim for far too long. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows major decisions. I'd positioned myself near the front window with a clear view of the security camera monitors when my family's convoy pulled into my driveway at exactly 10 o'clock. But they hadn't come alone. Along with my mother, Susan, father Tom, sister Angela, and her fiancé Brad, they had brought an entire entourage that made my jaw drop. Angela's best friend Casey climbed out of one car, followed by an older woman in professional attire carrying a leather portfolio, and most shockingly, a man with an expensive camera and press credentials hanging around his neck. Through the security system's audio, I could hear Angela directing the group like a military operation. "Remember, Calhoun is sometimes shy about attention, so let's make sure he feels comfortable with everything we've planned," she announced to the group. The older woman, who appeared to be in her 50s with perfectly styled gray hair, approached my front door first. She knocked confidently and called out, "Mr. Calhoun, this is Patricia Patterson from Elegant Occasions Wedding Planning. Your sister has told me so much about your generous support for her special day." My heart sank as I realized the full scope of what they had orchestrated. They hadn't just planned to manipulate me privately. They had created a public spectacle with professional witnesses who would make backing out socially and professionally embarrassing. The photographer stepped forward next, adjusting his camera settings while speaking loud enough for me to hear clearly. "I'm David Chen from the Denver Community News. We're here to feature your heartwarming family story about a generous brother hosting his sister's dream wedding. This kind of family support really resonates with our readers." Angela was crying what appeared to be genuine tears of frustration as she repeatedly pressed my doorbell. "Calhoun, please answer the door," she called out in a voice that sounded more desperate than manipulative. "Everyone is here to celebrate with us." Brad tried the hidden spare key that no longer worked, jiggling it in the lock with growing irritation. "This key isn't working," he announced to the group. "Maybe he changed the locks for security reasons." Mrs. Patterson consulted her notes, looking genuinely confused. "According to my conversation with Angela last week, the homeowner was completely enthusiastic about hosting the wedding here," she said to the photographer. "She assured me he was just too busy with his software engineering work to handle the details personally." The photographer nodded sympathetically and began taking pictures of my house from various angles. "Our readers love stories about successful professionals who use their resources to support family," he explained to Mrs. Patterson. Angela mentioned he specifically chose this beautiful property because he dreamed of hosting family celebrations here. Through the intercom system I had installed, I finally spoke to the group. "I need to speak with my immediate family members only. Everyone else needs to leave my property immediately." Mrs. Patterson looked startled, consulting her portfolio again. "Sir, I have signed contracts and vendor coordination meetings scheduled for today. Angela assured me you were fully committed to this wedding planning process." The photographer raised his camera hopefully. "Mr. Calhoun, could we just get a quick statement about what inspired you to make such a generous gesture for your sister? Our readers would love to hear about your family values." "There has been a misunderstanding," I said through the intercom, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need all non-family members to leave now, and I will only speak with my parents and sister." Casey, Angela's best friend, looked confused as she showed her phone to the group. "But Angela has been posting about this for weeks," she said, scrolling through social media. "She tagged the location and everything. All our friends are expecting updates about the wedding planning." Mrs. Patterson's professional demeanor was beginning to crack. "Sir, I've coordinated with multiple vendors based on commitments made in your name," she said firmly. "The catering company is expecting final payment this week. The florist has ordered specific arrangements. The rental company has scheduled deliveries for next weekend." I never authorized any of those commitments, I replied through the intercom. Any contracts signed with my name were done without my knowledge or consent. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson stared at Angela with a look of growing alarm. The photographer lowered his camera and stepped back slightly, apparently sensing that his heartwarming family story was becoming something much more complicated. Angela's tears intensified, but now they seemed to carry genuine panic rather than calculated manipulation. There has to be some kind of mistake, she said to Mrs. Patterson. My brother loves me. He wants to help with my wedding. Brad pulled Angela aside and whispered urgently in her ear, but their conversation was clearly audible through the security system. Did you actually talk to him about hosting the wedding here? He asked. I was going to talk to him today, Angela whispered back. Mom said he always agrees to help when we ask properly. Mrs. Patterson overheard this exchange and her expression shifted to professional alarm. Are you telling me that none of these commitments were actually authorized by the homeowner? She asked, her voice rising. The photographer began putting his camera equipment away quickly. I think I may have been given incorrect information about this story, he said diplomatically. I'll check back with my editor about our publication timeline. Casey looked mortified as she realized she was witnessing a family crisis rather than a celebration. Maybe I should leave too, she said quietly to Angela. This seems like something you need to work out privately. No one leaves until this gets resolved, Susan demanded, finally speaking up with her familiar authoritative tone. Calhoun is just being difficult because he doesn't like surprises. He'll come around once we explain everything properly. But Mrs. Patterson was already gathering her materials and heading back to her car. I cannot continue planning an event without clear authorization from the property owner, she announced. Angela, you'll need to resolve this situation before we can proceed with any vendor commitments. The photographer followed Mrs. Patterson toward the street, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding. Please call our office if you'd like to reschedule the interview under different circumstances, he told Angela, before driving away. As the professional witnesses departed, my family was left standing on my front porch, facing the reality that their elaborate public manipulation had collapsed before it even began. The confident orchestration had dissolved into confused desperation, and they finally had to confront me directly, without the social pressure they had tried to create. Through the security cameras, I watched their body language shift from confident expectation to uncertain fear, as they realized that their usual dynamic had fundamentally changed, and that I was no longer the predictable target they thought they could easily manipulate. With the outsiders gone, my family stood on my front porch, looking smaller and more uncertain than I had ever seen them. Through the intercom, I decided it was time to reveal exactly how much I knew about their deception. I heard everything yesterday, I said calmly, watching their faces through the security monitor. Every word about your stupid puppet with money, every detail about the fake pregnancy, the forged contracts, and your plan to steal $25,000 from me. The silence that followed was absolute. Angela's face went completely white. Brad took a step backward as if he might flee. Tom's hands clenched into fists and Susan's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Then chaos erupted. Angela spun around to face Brad, screaming, "You said they weren't talking about it until today. You promised me he couldn't have heard anything yesterday. How was I supposed to know he'd show up early?" Brad shot back. "Your mother said he never visits without calling first." Tom began pounding on my front door with both fists. "Calhoun, stop being dramatic and open this door right now," he demanded in his intimidating construction worker voice. "We're family, and we settle things face to face, not hiding behind security systems like a coward." Susan immediately shifted into her practiced victim mode, tears flowing as she pressed her face against my front window. "How could you spy on your own family?" she sobbed. "I'm so hurt that you would sneak around listening to private conversations. We were just excited about the wedding, and maybe got a little carried away with our planning. But I wasn't finished revealing what I had discovered. I know about Jake's $5,000 for the fake roof repairs. I continued through the intercom. I know about Aunt Martha's $3,000 for your imaginary surgery. I know about Uncle Robert, Cousin Sarah, and everyone else you've been scamming for the past year. Each revelation hit them like a physical blow. Susan stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the porch steps. Tom stopped pounding on the door and stared up at the security camera with a look of genuine fear. I know about Brad's Las Vegas trips while you claim to be broke, I continued. I know about Angela's Pinterest boards, planning her European honeymoon with my money. I know about the new furniture, the kitchen renovation, and Dad's new truck that you bought while telling everyone you were struggling financially. Angela collapsed into the porch chair, no longer even attempting to deny anything. "Oh God, we're in so much trouble," she whispered to herself. Brad tried one desperate attempt at damage control. "Look, maybe some things got exaggerated, but Angela really loves you and just wanted a beautiful wedding. We never meant to hurt anyone." "I have photos of the forged catering contracts," I replied. "I have evidence of every lie you told to vendors using my name. I have documentation of every family member you've stolen from, and I've already spoken to all of them." That was when Susan made her most desperate play. She suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed onto my front porch, gasping for air, and claiming she was having a heart attack from the stress of the confrontation. "Calhoun, your mother is dying!" Tom screamed at the security camera. "Open this door right now and call 911, or her death is on your conscience forever." For a moment, genuine terror shot through my chest. What if this was real? What if my confrontation had actually triggered a medical emergency? Angela was sobbing hysterically, begging me to help their mother. But instead of opening the door, I called 911 from inside the house and clearly stated my address and that someone on my front porch was claiming to have chest pains. I told the dispatcher that paramedics should approach from the street and that I would meet them at the front door. Within 8 minutes, an ambulance arrived with 2 paramedics who immediately began examining Susan. I opened the door and stepped outside to provide information, but stayed close to the entrance in case I needed to retreat quickly. The lead paramedic, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair, checked Susan's blood pressure, heart rate, and breathing, while asking detailed questions about her symptoms. After a thorough examination, she sat back on her heels with a skeptical expression. "Ma'am, your vital signs are completely normal," the paramedic announced. "Your blood pressure is actually lower than average, your heart rate is steady, and you're breathing normally. Are you sure you're experiencing chest pains?" Susan's performance began to falter under professional scrutiny. "Well, maybe it was just anxiety." She backtracked quickly. "Sometimes stress makes me feel like I'm having heart problems." The second paramedic, a young man who clearly had experience with false emergency calls, gave Susan and my family a stern lecture about the legal consequences of misusing emergency medical services. "Filing false emergency reports is a misdemeanor offense," he explained. "Emergency responders have limited resources, and calls like this prevent us from helping people with genuine medical crises." Susan was forced to admit she was not actually experiencing any physical symptoms beyond feeling upset about a family disagreement. The paramedics documented everything carefully and warned that repeated false calls could result in criminal charges and financial liability for emergency response costs. As the ambulance pulled away, my family stood on the porch, facing the complete failure of their final manipulation attempt. Every tool they had used to control me in the past had been systematically exposed and neutralized. Angela stared at me with a mixture of fear and something that might have been respect. "You really did your homework," she said quietly. "I learned from the best," I replied. "You taught me how to research, plan, and execute a strategy. You just never expected me to use those skills to defend myself against you." Tom's face was red with embarrassment and anger. But for the first time, he seemed to understand that his usual intimidation tactics were powerless. Susan had exhausted her supply of fake medical emergencies and emotional manipulations. Brad looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Maybe I should just go home and let you all work this out," he muttered, but Angela grabbed his arm desperately. "Don't you dare leave me here alone," she hissed. "You're part of this mess, too." Standing in my doorway, looking down at my family, I realized that all their power over me had come from my willingness to be manipulated. The moment I stopped playing by their rules and started documenting their behavior objectively, their entire system of control collapsed. But I wasn't finished. They still had no idea about the legal consequences they were facing, or the coordinated response I had organized with all their previous victims. The confrontation was just the beginning of the accountability they would face for their systematic fraud. Looking down at my family from my front doorway, I realized it was time to reveal the full extent of the investigation I had conducted and the coordinated response I had organized. They thought their biggest problem was that their current scam had been discovered, but they had no idea about the legal consequences approaching. I spent last night contacting every family member you've stolen from over the past year, I announced, watching their faces carefully. Jake, Aunt Martha, Uncle Robert, Cousin Sarah, and 6 others. They're all filing a coordinated complaint with the district attorney's office for fraud. Angela's remaining color drained completely from her face. Brad actually stumbled backward and grabbed the porch railing for support. Tom's expression shifted from anger to something approaching genuine fear. "You're bluffing," Susan said weakly, but her voice lacked any conviction. "The pattern of behavior you've shown constitutes organized fraud across state lines," I continued. "When you scammed Uncle Robert in Chicago and Cousin Sarah in Atlanta while living in Arizona, you made this a federal crime. My lawyer friend, who specializes in white-collar family financial crimes, has agreed to represent all the victims." This was when the true magnitude of their situation began to dawn on them. They had thought of their activities as small family manipulations, not realizing they had created a documented pattern of systematic fraud that could result in serious felony charges. "But we're family," Angela said desperately. "Families don't send each other to prison over money." "Families don't systematically steal from each other either," I replied. "But you made that choice for all of us." Brad tried to distance himself from the women in my family. "I was just going along with Angela's ideas," he said quickly. "I never stole money from anyone myself. I just knew about the wedding plan." "You forged my signature on the catering contract," I reminded him. "You personally committed identity theft and fraud. The penalties for those crimes don't depend on whose idea they were originally." Susan made one final attempt at her maternal guilt strategy. "I only wanted Angela to have a beautiful wedding because we never had much money when she was growing up. I wanted to give her something special that we couldn't afford ourselves." I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of their social media posts displaying their expensive purchases and luxury lifestyle. "Your new kitchen renovation cost more than most people's annual salary," I said. "Your guilt about Angela's childhood doesn't justify stealing from relatives who trusted you." But my most devastating revelation was still coming. While we had been talking, Mrs. Patterson had returned to my driveway, and this time she brought additional people with her. The catering company owner, the florist, and a representative from the party rental company had all arrived to demand immediate resolution of their payment issues. "Mr. Calhoun," Mrs. Patterson called out as she approached with the group of vendors. "These business owners need to speak with you about the financial commitments made in your name. Several of them have already ordered supplies and scheduled staff time based on contracts signed with your forged signature." The catering company owner, a stern-looking man in his 50s, was particularly angry. "Someone used your identity to order $8,000 worth of food and service," he explained. "We've already purchased ingredients and hired additional staff for next weekend. If this event isn't happening, we need immediate compensation for our losses." Angela tried desperately to maintain some version of her story. "There's just been a misunderstanding about the timing," she told the vendors. "The wedding is definitely happening, we just need to work out some details with my brother." But the florist, a middle-aged woman with soil-stained hands and a no-nonsense attitude, wasn't buying Angela's explanation. "Ma'am, your signature on our contract clearly states that your brother authorized and would pay for everything. If he's saying he never authorized these orders, then someone committed fraud using his identity." The party rental company representative nodded grimly. "Identity theft and contract fraud are serious crimes. We'll need to decide whether to pursue criminal charges or try to resolve this through civil court." Tom finally exploded under the pressure. "This is all getting blown out of proportion," he shouted. "We're family trying to work out a wedding, not criminals. Calhoun just needs to stop being stubborn and help his sister like families are supposed to do." But his outburst only made things worse. Mrs. Patterson stepped back and began taking notes on her phone. The vendors exchanged glances that clearly indicated they now understood this was not a simple family misunderstanding, but a systematic fraud scheme. "Sir," the catering company owner said firmly, "your family has created legal and financial obligations using someone else's identity without their consent. This isn't a family disagreement. It's criminal fraud that affects multiple businesses and their employees." The florist added, "We've seen situations like this before. Usually families who commit fraud against businesses have been practicing on their relatives first. This appears to be a pattern of criminal behavior, not a wedding planning misunderstanding." Angela finally broke down, completely admitting the truth in front of all the witnesses. "I know we should have asked first, but I was so excited about having a beautiful wedding. I thought if we planned everything perfectly, Calhoun would be happy to help us once he saw how much work we'd put into it." Her confession in front of multiple business owners essentially documented her admission of fraud. Mrs. Patterson continued taking notes while the vendors discussed among themselves whether they wanted to pursue criminal charges or attempt to recover their losses through civil litigation. Brad made his most cowardly decision yet, announcing to Angela in front of everyone, "I can't be part of this anymore. My family has a business reputation to maintain, and I can't be associated with fraud charges." He walked away from Angela while she begged him not to abandon her, removing his engagement ring and leaving it on my porch railing. Angela's dream wedding had just cost her the fiancé she thought she was planning it for. Susan began sobbing genuinely, for the first time finally understanding that their manipulative games had escalated into serious legal consequences that could affect their entire family's future. Tom stood silent and defeated, apparently realizing that his intimidation tactics were useless against business owners and legal authorities. Looking at my family surrounded by angry vendors and documented evidence of their crimes, I realized they were finally facing the reality that actions have consequences. They had spent months planning to manipulate me, but they had never planned for what would happen if their manipulation failed and their behavior became public knowledge. The vendors were discussing whether to coordinate their legal response or handle their individual cases separately. My family was facing not just the loss of their scam money, but potential criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and public exposure of their fraudulent behavior. For the first time in our entire relationship, I held all the power, and they were completely dependent on my willingness to help them avoid the worst consequences of their own choices. Standing on my front porch, looking at my defeated family, surrounded by angry vendors and evidence of their crimes, I realized this was the moment to choose what kind of person I wanted to be and what kind of family relationships I wanted to have going forward. Mrs. Patterson, could you and the other business owners give my family and me about 10 minutes to discuss how we want to handle this situation? I asked. I think there might be a way to resolve this that serves everyone's interests better than criminal charges and lawsuits. The vendors agreed to wait by their cars while I invited my family to sit on my front porch for the most serious conversation we had ever had. For the first time, I had their complete attention without any manipulation or performance. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, sitting across from them on the porch steps. "I could pursue full criminal charges for everything you've done. The evidence is overwhelming, and the financial crimes cross state lines, making some of them federal offenses. You could all face prison time, and your criminal records would affect your employment and housing options for the rest of your lives." Susan, Tom, and Angela listened in complete silence, finally understanding the magnitude of their situation. "Oh, but I'm offering you an alternative path," I continued, "one that focuses on making things right rather than punishment. Here are my non-negotiable conditions." I pulled out a notebook where I had written my terms during the vendor discussions. "First, you will repay every penny you've stolen from family members within 6 months. That's approximately $15,000 that needs to be returned to Jake, Aunt Martha, Uncle Robert, Sarah, and the others you've scammed." Tom started to protest that they didn't have that kind of money available, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Second, Mom and Dad, you will attend family counseling to understand why you raised children who thought manipulation and theft were acceptable ways to solve problems. Susan, you will also attend individual therapy to address whatever emotional issues made you think fake medical emergencies were appropriate ways to get attention and money." Susan looked genuinely surprised that I was requiring her to examine her own behavior rather than just demanding financial restitution. "Third, Angela, you will personally contact every vendor you deceived and every family member you helped steal from. You will apologize, sincerely explain that your behavior was wrong, and commit to making financial amends. No excuses, no blame shifting, just honest acknowledgement of what you did." Angela nodded slowly, tears flowing steadily down her cheeks. "Fourth, all of you will acknowledge the deeper damage you've caused beyond just the money. You've destroyed my ability to trust my own family. You've created suspicion and hurt feelings throughout our extended family. You've taught me that your love was conditional on my financial usefulness to you." This was the part that hurt most to say, but it needed to be said. "I don't know if our relationships can ever be rebuilt, but they'll have to be built on complete honesty from now on. No more manipulation. No more lies. No more treating me like an ATM machine you can access through emotional blackmail." Tom spoke for the first time since the vendors had arrived. "Son, I know we messed up bad. I let pride keep me from asking for help honestly when the business was struggling, and I taught your sister that lying was easier than working. That was wrong." Susan surprised me by speaking next, and for the first time, her voice carried genuine remorse instead of calculated emotion. "I think I got addicted to the easy money and the feeling of being clever enough to manipulate people. I convinced myself that family members should want to help each other, so taking money wasn't really stealing. But listening to you talk to those business owners made me realize I've been lying to myself about what we were really doing." Angela lifted her head and looked at me directly. "I'm 24 years old and I've never had an honest relationship with anyone because I learned to lie and manipulate to get what I wanted. Brad was right to leave me. I don't even know who I really am when I'm not trying to get something from someone else." Her admission gave me hope that real change might be possible. I stood up and walked over to the vendors to negotiate resolution of their immediate financial losses. The catering company agreed to accept payment for their food costs and cancellation fees. The florist would keep her deposit to cover already purchased flowers but waive additional penalties. Mrs. Patterson would charge only for her time spent on planning, not her full fee. The party rental company agreed to waive charges since no equipment had been delivered yet. In total, the immediate vendor costs were approximately $4,000. I made the difficult decision to pay these costs myself, not as a reward for my family's behavior, but to prevent the business owners from suffering financial losses for my family's crimes. But I made it clear to my family that this $4,000 would be the first debt they would repay to me as part of their restitution plan. Over the following months, my family slowly began the difficult process of accountability and change. Tom took a part-time evening job at a local hardware store to generate additional income for repaying relatives. The work was humbling for someone who had owned his own construction business, but he admitted it helped him understand the value of honest wages. Susan started volunteering at a nonprofit financial counseling center, helping families avoid the debt and desperation that had led to their criminal behavior. Working with genuinely struggling families helped her understand the difference between real hardship and manipulative greed. Angela postponed any thoughts of marriage and focused on rebuilding her relationships with the relatives they had hurt. Some family members forgave her quickly, while others needed more time to trust again. She took a second job at a retail store and committed to repaying relatives from her own earnings, rather than asking Tom and Susan to handle all the financial restitution. 6 months later, we held a small family barbecue in my backyard, the same space where Angela had planned to host her fraudulent wedding. The gathering was humble and honest in a way our family events had never been before. Angela brought her new boyfriend Marcus, a teacher she had met at her retail job, who knew about her past mistakes and was helping her build honest relationship skills. She announced they were talking about marriage, but planned to save money for their own small ceremony rather than manipulating relatives to pay for their dreams. Susan presented me with a handwritten ledger documenting every penny that had been repaid to relatives, along with copies of personal apology letters she had sent to each person they had wronged. Tom brought photos from his hardware store job, admitting that learning to work for someone else again had taught him humility and respect for honest labor. Most importantly, they had all completed the counseling requirements and seemed genuinely committed to maintaining honest relationships going forward. As we sat around my patio table eating hamburgers and talking about ordinary family topics, I reflected on the painful but necessary lesson we had all learned. Love without boundaries is not really love, it's enablement. Sometimes caring for family means refusing to participate in their destructive behavior even when that refusal creates conflict and discomfort. The family I had now was smaller and more fragile than the one I had before, but it was built on truth rather than manipulation. Trust once broken by systematic deception had to be rebuilt through consistent, honest actions over time. There were no shortcuts or emotional appeals that could restore what had been damaged by their choices. My parents and sister had learned that their actions carried real consequences that extended far beyond their immediate family. They had discovered that treating relatives' love and concern as opportunities for financial exploitation ultimately destroyed the very relationships they claimed to value. Most importantly, I had learned that protecting my own emotional and financial well-being was not selfish or unloving. Setting firm boundaries and demanding accountability was actually the most loving thing I could do for family members who had lost their way morally and ethically. The most valuable thing I had protected during this crisis was not the $25,000 they had planned to steal. It was my self-respect and my belief that authentic family relationships were possible. By refusing to enable their manipulation, I had created space for genuine change and growth. As we cleaned up from dinner that evening, Angela pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I know it's going to take a long time for you to trust me again," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that losing Brad and facing the possibility of criminal charges was the best thing that ever happened to me. I finally had to look at who I really was and decide who I wanted to become." Standing in my backyard as the sun set over Denver, I realized that families, like any other relationships, have to be built on mutual respect and honest communication. When those foundations are damaged by manipulation and betrayal, they can only be restored through accountability, hard work, and time. The story of my family's fraud attempt had become a story about redemption, not through miraculous forgiveness, but through the difficult work of acknowledging mistakes, making amends, and committing to better choices going forward. I want to ask you something important. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your love and generosity? How did you find the courage to say no when people you cared about were asking for help, even if their requests seemed unreasonable or manipulative? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others who might be dealing with similar family manipulation find these insights. Subscribe to hear more stories about real-life situations where ordinary people had to make difficult choices to protect their well-being and build healthier relationships. And please share this story with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries with family members, even when those boundaries create conflict or discomfort. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of a community that believes in honest relationships and personal accountability. I hope you find the courage to protect your own well-being while still caring for the people you love. Take care, and remember that you deserve relationships built on truth and mutual respect.